BESE members, members of the audience, if you please take your seats, we'll go ahead and begin the BESE Policy Forum. Good morning, Walter. How you doing?
Take you back. Take you back.
Are you? Good, James. Just keep that in mind. You've been incredibly grateful, like nobody else.
How are you?
And then secondly,
Provided place for you out there.
I know, they gave me my name this year. Isn't that
Great.
great?
They could have done put you over there with no chair. Did you get your picture right yet?
we see them, of course,
Did you get your picture?
put it out there, but we're not sure. They took that into silence at the time. So it's the same thing, Jack. Jack said, he's going to do that. You're welcome. It's her husband is tech. I just said, you have to get your conversation.
Yeah, I know. Of all people, that's what you feel saying. That all said. Yeah, that's that. Honestly, if I would look back on it, what Joel had done in New York, he wouldn't have taken the risk. Good morning, John. He wouldn't have taken the risk.
No, I think I've had one.
Okay, board members, are we almost ready? Okay, we're continuing on this process of having a policy forum on what we consider to be important and timely items that the board will be looking at taking policy actions on. This month's policy forum is on the ESEA Flexibility Initiative, and we're going to, it is more of an informational type of presentation. There will not be looking for motions or directives from the board on this, although you're free to ask questions, particularly if something comes to your mind about a particular perspective policy question or policy initiative. So given that, we also have a time frame that we're going to try to stay within, and that is 1 hour. So we will hope to adjourn the policy forum at 10:15, break for 5, maybe 10 minutes, and then move straight into the board meeting. So that's the format for today, and with that, we'll get started.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. We wanted to come and present today what was referred to as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act Flexibility Initiative, or more commonly referred to as the waiver that you may have heard of. I'll introduce the purpose of this in a second, but fair to say that many of the staff who have done critical work and will continue to do critical work are here this morning. Jessica Tucker at the desk has led the initiative across departments. Aaron Bendeley, whose office the federal programs resides in, has taken a huge role in this. Scott Norton, as accountability and assessment, is a major piece of this work as well. And new to our staff is Kunja Narachania, who's not new to the state because she was chief of staff at the Recovery School District under my leadership, and is now will be chief of staff in our agency going forward. She's an educator from the North Carolina public schools and from the Chicago public school system, is new with me to Louisiana. We worked together for many years in Chicago, and I'm very proud to have her here in Baton Rouge with us.
Welcome.
Just to talk about this briefly, and I will, she is here. Sorry, Kunjan, maybe you could raise your hand. Just to talk briefly about what ESEA is and why this is of a critical nature for this board. As you know, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is the federal law that both funds states around public education and provides strings, or in essence, regulations that come with that funding. If you receive federal funding, you must abide by the rules that the federal government sets in implementing those programs. And so when you hear things like Title I, for example, Title II, Title III, those all come out of ESEA. President Bush, the second President Bush, as you know, passed No Child Left Behind, which is just a name for ESEA. In other words, it's the same act, it's been reauthorized. He passed it under the moniker of No Child Left Behind. But No Child Left Behind had particular elements to it that were extremely unique. And some of those involved a requirement around testing, measurement, and reporting around subgroups of kids, whether they're by race and ethnicity, whether it's by special education, and so on. And over time, similar initiatives by various administrations at the federal level have led to a kind of accretion of rules and regulations that, if you look back on them, have basically shaped state bureaucracies across the country. And so a large number of state employees and really district employees, you'll hear refer to themselves as school improvement officer, Title I officer, class size reduction officer, Title I pre-K officer, and so on. And so much of our agency, as well as others, is because various federal administrations have tied new regulations to ESEA. This current federal administration under Arne Duncan has basically said we need to continue our accountability regime, which clearly we support. But on the other hand, we need to ensure that whatever is in ESEA that is not leading to student achievement and perhaps is even distracting from the work of student achievement, we try to change. And Congress has not moved on changes to the legislation, so the Secretary has exercised his authority to offer states the opportunity to create their own means of administering federal programs, and it is calling it a waiver. In essence, you can create your own means of it by waiving the federal program. So this is a wide-ranging offer for us to set our own terms around accountability, around how funds are awarded, et cetera, but it has to be approved by the feds. And second, it has to be something that is something that the State Department has said this is how we want to do it. There are pieces within this that ultimately would have to come in front of the BESE board in order to be executed. Accountability programs would be an example. There are pieces of it that don't. How we organize ourselves as a department, you know, should this person be called this person should be called this. So what we're proposing today to you is not anything for a particular decision. It's to see where is this waiver in process, and we need to get to a place where we determine whether we do it in the first place. But we're going ahead with the policy. And we want to call out for you areas that will ultimately come back in front of the board if we do go ahead with this, if the federal government does ultimately approve it. But I do want to say that our administration, under my leadership's disposition, is one of sustaining accountability while removing red tape that gets in the way of educators. And I will tell you, having worked in the Recovery School District, which is regulated by a state, having worked in the nation's largest school system, New York City, which is regulated by New York State, I am 100% convinced that Washington's, and to a degree, Baton Rouge's and Albany's interference in the day-to-day lives of schools is a more prohibitive thing to student achievement than it is enabling of student achievement. So why don't we move through the proposal and what this actually is. So in essence, this flexibility initiative says that three things. Number one, we can remove pieces of the regulation that are particularly prohibitive. Number two, that we can ensure that there are high standards for academic achievement sustained. And number three, that if there are really, that because some of these issues that I'll describe present such big problems for states in years to come, this actually offering this waiver while Congress decides whether or not to change the education statutes gives an opportunity for some relief for states to make change. There are 375 million of federal education dollars flowing to Louisiana schools. And I just want to emphasize that. And when you're a superintendent, as obviously Superintendent Lee knows, or Ms. Beebe knows, being a district administrator, and other board members, the way you think of those dollars is that they are tied up into buckets that you and your principals have to spend on particular things. So when a principal receives their budget, depending on the district, they very oftentimes receive it and say, okay, I cannot spend this dollar to backfill this teacher. I have to spend it on this. And that is can be a real challenge. While you don't want to lose accountability, it's very, very challenging for educators in the field when they see these kinds of restrictions, because a dollar to a child is a dollar to a child. Second, the No Child Left Behind framework says that teachers, in order to be certified, it has to be based on university degrees, et cetera, that while valuable in some cases, for example, a teacher of calculus should surely be trained in math, have not really proven to lead to student achievement in the way that you could say distinguish whether I, as an elementary school teacher, have an English degree or I have a sociology degree. And it can get absurd to a point where an economics major from MIT may well not be qualified to teach math in our high schools. Effectiveness in the classroom would seem to be a more logical way of assessing whether or not someone should be certified to teach in our classrooms than should trying to parse out higher education degrees and so on. And finally, the federal government has predetermined what the goals should be for our schools by saying every year you have to make what is called adequate yearly progress toward 100% proficiency in 2014. And the federal government has said, well, maybe we should actually allow states more flexibility on that. I think that that's one area where we actually feel like we should continue very rigorous goals for student achievement, and that flexibility in that area, my disposition, and I think our administrations would be, we should actually sustain high standards while allowing more flexibility on the inputs. So what is expected in return from this? As I said before, number one, we have the opportunity to get rid of burdensome reporting and administrative responsibilities. I cannot tell you how many reports the federal government requires from the state, how many reports the state in turn requires from the districts, and how many, frankly, reports we superintendents at the district level oftentimes ask of our principals. And I would say probably half of them are because the federal government, at a minimum half, requires these reports to be done, or we as a state have interpreted that the federal government requires them to be done. Second, we can provide accountability and specific rewards, supports, and consequences for people reaching or not reaching targets. And third, we can really move toward new standards, and adopting college standards, college and career ready standards, is something this board has already done, and we can expect to do that as part of this application. So the federal government has said that for those grants that were not submitted early in November, and we were in the midst of a board transition, we were in the midst of a superintendent transition likely, and so at the time the department elected not to submit a waiver application in anticipation of this transition that's obviously taken place, that in February, on the 21st, we would submit a flexibility application to the federal government for their consideration. If what is happening now happens to us, we would then go through a round of conversations with them, and they would make a determination as to whether or not to approve our application for changes in the areas that I've outlined. There are outside reviewers. It is not a competitive process like Race to the Top. States that have the right application do get awarded it, and they have indicated that the process will be a cooperative one, although initial indications are that the discussions have been of a critical nature. There are criteria, and I'm just going to lay them out very, very quickly for what a highly qualified application would look like. One, it would ensure that the state is adopting college and career standards. Under Aaron and Scott's leadership, we are already doing that. Second, we must commit to develop, adopt, and implement high-quality systems of educator evaluation. And thankfully, formerly under Rain Martin, under Ressa Cofield's leadership in Louisiana, we are already doing that at the district level through Act 54. Second, we have to create a plan that rewards schools that are high performing, where we focus on schools that have the largest achievement gaps and lowest achieving, and that we prioritize the lowest achieving schools in a way that says, okay, we have a set of low performing schools, we have a set of high performing schools. How are we incenting schools to perform at a high level? What are we doing as a state to help turn around our lowest performing schools? I have to say, I think here Louisiana is particularly well set up as well, because we have the nation's most, I believe, thoughtful and certainly robust plan around our lowest performing schools. I would say this, the degree to which we really are rewarding our high performers and creating incentives, I think is still of some question. And finally, and I actually happen to think this is the greatest challenge of all, how do we reduce the burden that I hear our superintendents and principals calling me and emailing me about on a regular basis almost every day? Our State Department and our federal government have, with all of the best intentions, created a lot of distractions from the classroom. A lot of energy goes outside the classroom in our public school systems and in our charter public school systems, and even in what we ask of our independent and private schools. And we have to address that issue seriously. This gives us an opportunity to do it. So we went out and we did a set of stakeholder surveys, and we surveyed on 20 questions. We posted the outcomes on the website to kind of get an initial feel for what the preferences were out there. We targeted a large number of stakeholders as well. And we saw a lot of response. We saw a lot of response from educators in the field, from superintendents, from administrators, and certainly from business leaders and advocates as to what they would like to see in our waiver application. There was an articulated view around what an accountability system should do, which was one of the primary focuses of the survey. And I think, as makes total sense, most people responded and said that it should motivate improvement, that it should be easy to communicate. And I do want to stress that as well. I know this has been an issue of some concern to the board, that as fantastic and as ahead of the curve as our accountability system has been in Louisiana, it perhaps over time has become somewhat hard to define for educators in the field and parents in the field. Not whether or not an F is better than an A, clearly that's clear, but how did you get to an F in the first place? What is the mechanism, or what is the measure of an A? It is hard to explain, and that we could be more simple, and that focuses on proficiency, that should be about student achievement. I think people thought there were certainly strengths in the current system, as we've articulated before, but that there are weaknesses. And interestingly enough, the top weakness that people said, and this came particularly from superintendents, and I think this is actually most interesting of all in the survey, is that even in this very complex policy landscape, people called out restrictions on federal funds as the top issue that they would change when it comes to the accountability system. Meaning that in tight budget times across the state, even though MFP has not been cut, it has been a tight budget time for many of our schools, with pension obligations increasing and so on. Superintendents, and I, having sat in this seat, know this. When you are told, I cannot fill a budget gap just because this dollar comes from Washington, it doesn't make a lot of sense in running your organization, and it is understandable that educators would respond in that way. Interestingly enough, our people in the field don't really think much about the adequate yearly progress system. They think in Louisiana about SPS. And I do want to tell you that that's a fantastic thing about Louisiana, that this board has been so successful in school performance score being a predominant way of thinking about school performance. That's not the case in many states, but it is clear that adequate yearly progress is not the way that our educators come to work thinking about their school success every day. And that actually, frankly, many people don't even understand the difference between SPS and AYP in the first place. So it makes some sense to think about how could we actually simplify our accountability system around the things that we already have in place in Louisiana. I think that the achievement gap question, the idea of serving all kids, is something that clearly is supported and that we shouldn't get away from that, and that was evident in the survey. And so then the question is, if this is what people generally believe, where directionally are we headed and what can we get out of this? And I will pause after this quickly. So one, we could get more flexibility in how we use our funds and how our districts use their funds. Two, we as a state could actually set in motion a process of reducing our own reporting requirements as well as federal reporting requirements that our districts and principals have to take on. Three, we could actually create a regime of accountability that is the one that we want, ambitious but simplified, adherent to our own standards around issues like school performance score rather than to outside measures just around AYP. And then we could really do this on a backbone that, frankly, this board has built and supported, which is Act 54 and our teacher and principal effectiveness system, which is our Common Core standards, which is our clear and transparent accountability system with letter grades, which is our district support model that Ms. Beebe spoke about yesterday, and which is our intervention in persistently failing schools like the RSD. So I hope you see that a lot of the pillars that they're looking for are here, and what this waiver could give us the opportunity to do is to get out of the way of our educators in implementing these programs. I think the challenges with the current federal regulations we've talked enough about, but to emphasize they are cumbersome. And so where we are thinking currently is along the following lines. One, keeping to our core values around closing achievement gaps and that all children can learn. Two, creating accountability systems that are transparent, that motivate higher performance, that distinguish between district and school performance based on how well they're actually doing on proficiency, that still measure subgroups, that look at students by race and ethnicity, that look at special education, that look at low-performing students, but that reward clearly the places that are making really strong gains with their kids, schools and districts. That expands access to higher performing schools among students, and that actually builds on our implementation of Common Core standards, our teacher effectiveness system, and an aligned program of assessments going forward. Our current recommendations are that we simplify and increase transparency for school performance score and district performance score, that we make this a more simple calculation. Two, that we align how we grade iLEAP, LEAP, and end-of-course assessments so that it's clear that what you say on the iLEAP is a rating of a student translates to that rating on an end-of-course assessment in clear terminology. Three, that we create incentives for districts, schools around performance, especially with subgroups of low-performing kids. Fourth, that we maintain strong proficiency goals, but that we alter interventions slightly so that we have some interventions in districts that are failing, schools that are failing, but that we also, as I said, make sure that we have rewards on the flip side for high-performing schools and districts. And that five, and this probably I believe is most critical, that we get serious about getting out of the way of educators by actively reducing the barriers on reporting and on requirements for what they have to do with their dollars day to day. We have the framework in place, as I hope you see from this, but it will not happen if we continue to distract educators. Let's move through as we can talk more about specific questions later. This application, as I said, is due February 21. We have a plan that is required for stakeholder engagement that would happen between now and then. This would, we wanted to have kind of be a kickoff to our engagement process. One way or the other, there's a large number of policies that fall under the buckets that I described, and some of them would have to come back in front of this board. For example, if you were going to change accountability regulations, clearly that would have to come back under this board. If you're going to change the kind of incentive structures that we were talking about, clearly it would have to come back in front of this board. But other pieces just around who in the department we assign various pieces of work and how we might change particular reports would not have to come back in front of this board. And so we wanted to share with you the entire picture of what ultimately will be required to open a dialogue with you and to answer your questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Superintendent White. Are there is there any further presentations by department staff? Okay, and then it's time to entertain questions and comments. Mr. Lee.
I'm very pleased to hear what you're saying. I think the last several months we've seen change in the direction of the State Department of Education, particularly with the work that Rain Martin has been doing. And I'd have to say I regret to see her leave her position, but I hope that momentum will continue. She's done a good job, I think, of relating to and working with local school systems. And that it hadn't always been that way in the past. So I think that was good, and the other staff members are doing the same thing. I think we need better communication, better understanding, and I'm pleased with what I'm hearing you say this morning. Looks to me like we should go after whatever federal dollars we can get, because I don't see how they can put any more restrictions on us than what we already have. And if there's any possibility of more flexibility, then we need to try to get that. I would hope that it's not too late, and I'm not sure where it stands with the federal funds for early childhood education. Looks to me like we need that, whatever federal assistance we can get for early childhood education. So I hope that's in your thinking somewhere. And just a comment, it doesn't do any good, but I'll comment anyway. I see Donna Nolaganey out there. She works very well with us, and she empathizes with us, but some of the restraints we've had on these federal dollars is just unbelievable, particularly in low-performing schools where they require that school uses its Title I money at parent discretion for outside services with companies that looks to me like have no idea what's happening at the school, how to help the school. It's just not a good way to spend those federal dollars. And I'd really like to see that it's relatively minor, but it's a point that where money is just not spent the way it ought to be spent to help children.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Any other comments? Okay, we'll start with Ms. Beebe and then Ms. Bopey.
Thank you, Ms. Aston. And I agree with you, Mr. Lee, that the guiding principles, I certainly subscribe to those, but I want to go back to the waivers. I need clarification, Mr. White, when we say that we would issue, and I'm asking, is it to issue a waiver to replace expectations for highly qualified teachers and school leaders with expectations for effective teachers and school leaders? Is that the course of the path that we will take?
Well, I think we're still deciding that. Obviously, if teacher certification regulations were to change, they would have to likewise come back in front of this board. To be clear about the process, the federal government has asked us to say, what are your intentions? In other words, what's the best plan possible? They know that clearly the board is not going to be able to work on every policy change that is permitted by this waiver request by February 21st. So they basically asked us for what does a roadmap look like in Louisiana, knowing that on many of these issues the BESE board would have to actively change the regulations themselves ultimately. So on highly qualified teachers, I think we are conducting our own process. We're going to be conducting a stakeholder process. And one of the questions we'll want to be asking the public and certainly educators is the way that we are credentialing teachers currently leading to ensuring that the most effective person is in the classroom? And I think that, in some respects, the Bush administration upped the bar for teacher quality by saying all teachers have to be certified, essentially, which is a positive thing. The challenge in doing that is that we, in essence, then created another bureaucracy, another set of bureaucratic rules that weren't really ever about student achievement. They were about this rule for higher ed and that rule for K-12 and so on. And I think that's the question that we'll want to be asking. But a change in certification rules ultimately would require this board's approval.
Well, as a human resources director, I do recognize the challenges with highly qualified, particularly when the certification range in the past we had grades 1 to 8, and now you have the they're segmented 1 to 5, 6 to 8, and so forth. That does create a great challenge for me as a human resources director. But once again, I would venture to say that, well, I will certainly say that I am certainly not in support of waiving standards or certification requirements, and I hope that that's not this state's intent, because we have prescribed standards, and I think we at least need to meet the certification requirements. I would certainly be willing to go back to the table to say, to speak to my concerns, and many personnel directors across the state regarding the specific certification requirements that currently exist. Now, getting into the highly qualified, which makes it more demanding and more challenging for personnel directors, I would certainly want to engage in that conversation. But to simply say that certification doesn't matter, I take great issue with that.
Let me respond in two ways, and this obviously is a discussion that we should have and are anxious to have. I think there are two issues. One is that by creating rules, I think we do sometimes tie the hands, with all best intentions, of our HR directors, because we, in essence, create a situation where we list out a set of majors, and we say only these people can be qualified to teach this and that, and almost inevitably there's a circumstance where someone who's really would be a great teacher of that, we just left off the major list, and all of a sudden you've got a physics major at Caltech who can't teach algebra in Louisiana schools. The other side of it is that when we ultimately give someone full certification, that person has had time in the classroom. We know how effective that person has been, and yet that information is never used in granting that person a license to teach in Louisiana. And so that, I think, is a challenge as well that we should consider, that there is some information we're not bringing to bear in the certification decision. But clearly, we want the state to retain its power around certification, and we want to come back and revisit the discussion with you about what should be in, to your point, Ms. Beebe, what should be in the certification criteria.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. Bophy?
So I am a consultant for CCSSO, which is the Council for Chief State School Officers, and they've been involved in the flexibility waiver. And I thought that it was very important to get you on board at this point, because I know in terms of timeline. And so I'm happy that we have you in place, and that your leadership in the state, as we consider this flexibility waiver and what the components will be very important. So I'm happy to see also that there's some groundwork done, and that we're at a stage where we can start talking about stakeholder input. One thing that just came up to me and is with No Child Left Behind, there was a focus on proficiency, and so really a focus on minimal standards. And I'm not sure that this is something that we would even want to tie ourselves into, but what have you guys thought about or looked at high achieving? Because I think that a lot of students have been left out of the discussion for a number of years because our focus has been on closing the achievement gap, which is an important focus, but at the same time that we've had loss. So, and I'm not sure that it would even be able to, that we could work that in here, but I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
Well, I think it's a discussion that looks different at different parts of our accountability system currently. And the degree to which a school is rewarded for having kids who are achieving right now in, for instance, our graduation index at a high level, well, we are giving some awards for that.
Right.
On the other hand, that's not entirely reflected across our system. So I do think it's important that that be a consideration. Another question this raises is the kind of idea of student progress, and where is that in this system? Mm-hmm. And then finally is the idea, so what are the rewards, in essence, for when a school does make high progress or achieves a high bar, and so on as well. So all of those three pieces would ultimately have to be accounted for in whatever proposal was made back to the board around accountability. Agreed. But I take your point and think it's absolutely right that in the end we have to get to a system that acknowledges that you can go from 16 to 18 on the ACT, but you can also go from 22 to 26 on the ACT, and those are both important pieces of progress. Let me finally say that this board has taken some other steps that haven't necessarily been acted on. One is to look at the ACT as a part of the accountability regime at the high school level. And that's something that we're considering past board actions like that, things the board has said the department needs to do in this process as well. And so it's about not just achieving on a Louisiana standard perhaps, but on a national standard through assessments like the ACT.
I'd also like to say, because I know that some board members might be thinking about this for the first time, is that when I look at this in terms of other states and their progress, and then I compare that to where we are as a state, it doesn't seem like there's anything new in it for Louisiana. It's not as though our districts are going to have to start doing something new, but that it would refine things that they already do. And so I think that should be reassuring to the other board members, and that I don't see anything that would keep us from engaging in these talks with the Department of Education for this flexibility.
Yep.
Thank you, Ms. Bophy. Anyone else have question or comment on this matter? Mr. Romer.
I would thank the superintendent for the presentation and the staff. I think your point is clear when you talk to almost any stakeholder, regardless of whether that's a principal, teacher, parent. They're all seeking more flexibility. No two children are the same, no two schools are the same, no two districts are the same. And we've had, with good intentions, both at the state and federal level, of a habit of trying to prescribe a set of rules that are applicable in every instance. And no set of rules exist that are applicable in every instance. So I applaud the idea of us seeking these waivers. I think we need to seek them. We need to think through clearly, how do you tie freedom with outcomes and effectiveness, and accountability. And that's the key, is we need to trust the individuals in the field to do their jobs. We need to put into place standards to make sure we have the best people we can find out in the field. And then we need to give them the freedom to do their job, free from the burdens of, while well-intentioned, what becomes red tape. But understand, and I would say this to board members, a lot of the things that we have done already and things that we will consider over this year, they're all tied together. That alone, no one move solves our problem. That freedom without accountability probably leads to chaos, but freedom tied with accountability hopefully leads to better outcomes. So I would say that we ought not have this discussion. It's a perfect policy form. We need to talk about it and tee up the issue. But this idea impacts everything that we do. And as we consider other issues like Act 54 and things, understand that they're tied together. The idea of granting more freedom has to come with the idea of accountability. The idea of high outcomes should be tied to merit and other things that we should consider. So, the idea of freedom alone is not the consideration here. Is how do we put together a framework to allow both more freedom, but also maintain our higher standards of accountability. I think this is certainly a great first step, and I appreciate you bringing it to our attention. And I think districts are begging for the freedom, and I think most districts will be willing to accept the accountability if they are given the appropriate freedoms to make those decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Romer. Any other comments from board members on this item? Then, if not, I have a couple. Superintendent White, as you embark on the stakeholder engagement part of this process, I do encourage you, as you travel around the state and have meetings, if you're going into a BESE members area, please consider inviting that BESE member to join you, to be there, to hear, to provide input, and to be able to share that with their fellow BESE members. Also, as the superintendent pointed out, this deadline is February 21st, so there will be obviously a lot of work and an application submitted before this board meets again. So I think it's important, Superintendent White, that you develop a communications sort of strategy plan with the board so that we are kept abreast of what, as this application is being crafted. So I think it's important that you keep us in the loop.
So we certainly will, and thank you very much for your interest. This is a critical piece that I think is, as has been said by board members, only upside for us, and that we get to determine as a group what it is that we want to seek. But it will set a course of work in motion that we will need to work on together.
Yeah, and I'd finally like to say that I think it was really great, just perchance, that you were a superintendent of a district so that you could experience firsthand the frustrations that our superintendents have been feeling around the burdens of paperwork and reporting and restrictions. So I hear that frustration, and I also hear the determination to relieve that burden from our districts and our district leadership, and I think that's good. Mr. Lee?
Yeah, I'm glad to have some help from the state government.
We knew you needed it, Walter.
Okay, well, unless there's further comments from department staff or Superintendent Wyatt?
The only thing I would say is I want to reflect to you that we, having worked with many states, I'm really astounded at the quality of the staff, the particular staff that are working on this particular initiative, from Dr. Norton to Ms. Bendaly to Ms. Tucker, and the only reason I'm laughing is that I'm still getting used to calling people by their last names, but I'm going to, I will get used to that. Thank you very much.
I guess it's a Southern thing. Okay, well, in that case, if there are no further comments, we'll go ahead and adjourn the policy forum. As you can see, we're adjourning a little early. I suspect that Ms. Posniak will advise me that we cannot commence the board meeting more than 30 minutes before the stated 10:45 time, so we'll start the board meeting promptly at 10:15 if that's agreeable to the board. Okay, thank you. That's the plan.